Good morning, dear friends. Holy Yidden. Today is Friday, the 5th of Adar 1, the 15th of March. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Meseches. Why are we staring at Eli's empty chair? Or is it just me? Presently studying Meseches Pesachim chapter 7. We're 76a. To turn the page soon, 76b. We are really talking about the Korban Pesach and how it must be exclusively cooked by the heat of fire. The Mishnah goes through different other scenarios where there may be an element of cooking that's not directly from the fire. And depending on the degree, the extent, and the other criteria might depend on how much of the Korban Pesach needs to be removed. And this ends up having bearings on another conversation, a debate between Rava and Shmuel about kosher and non-kosher, or milk and meat that encounter one another. And as we noted, for milk and meat to be considered cooked together, number one, it needs to be milk and meat. And number two, they both need to be hot. Otherwise, there is not a full transfer of flavor from one to the other. Similarly, for a kosher and non-kosher substance to contact and exchange flavor, they must both be hot. What does that mean practically? It means that we need to figure out, if one item is hot and one item is cold, which one's temperature overrides or overpowers the other. Does the hot override the cold? Does the cold override the hot? And what emerges is that it depends directionally. Which one is above and which one is below, which one is falling, which one is landing. And Rav and Shmuel have a debate. Shmuel says it all depends on the receiving keli, the receiving dish. And Rav says it all depends the descending, the falling, the upper, ila gavar, tata gavar. Before we go into the Gemara, of course, we're dedicating our learning for the well-being of the dear members of our Chabura and their households. Everyone should be healthy and well. All types of refuahs. And we should not only be healthy, but we should feel healthy and feel good. And that's important. Of course, we dedicate our learning in prayerful wishes for good news from Eretz Yisrael, for our chayalim, those that are bravely fighting. They should be successful and safe. Those who need to recover from injuries in the course of their service should have a refuah shlema, a healing of nefesh and guf, body and soul. And we should only have good news for Klal Yisrael. I do want to mention our dear friend Eliot Tzvi ben Rabbana Sipora for his full, complete healing and health, and only simchas in the family, and everyone that's traveling in for simchas should be able to travel b'toich simcha v'tuv levav in a good, healthy, joyous circumstance. I do want to mention, of course, that this Sunday we'll be having a gathering honoring our dear Dr. Pasternak in conjunction with the upcoming Shloshim and Shmuel Yisrael Moshe ben Shmuel Halevi, our dear friend, and his neshama Shavan Aliyah, and he'll forever be part of our Chabura and part of the memory and the intention of our learning. And as I've shared before, and we'll share on Sunday, the Gemara notes, Shamati Shahayu Aimrim. One of the sages in heaven say that they overheard a conversation. We actually learned this Gemara in Brachas, and it's also in Pesachim later on. He heard a comment by the angels in heaven. They would say, Ashrei Misha Balaka and V'Talmudai Biyadei. Lucky is the person who arrives in heaven and has Talmud under their belt. And so, dare I say that joining a Talmud Chabura is certainly a good way to have Talmud under your belt. And there's no question Dr. Pasternak, with his commitment and devotion to learning, even when it was extremely inconvenient and challenging. And as I told the family, and we can all agree, he had every excuse not to join, and yet it was important to him and to the wonderful Mrs. Pasternak for facilitating and being an equal partner in our Chabura. It's a tribute and certainly a bracha in Gan Eden for him and his family and for all of us. And so we should only have good news. And I'm sure whatever I've said is agreed with and concurred by all the dear members of our Chabura. And as I shared yesterday, I was looking through. I didn't have enough time to spend there. 2 days ago, I was trying to find a good snapshot of our Chabura in the Zoom perspective. I couldn't find it, but I couldn't help but feel very sentimental and emotional about the many many years that we had the privilege to spend together on Zoom, in addition to in real life. And as I shared with the family, growing up, Dr. Pasternak was very, very gracious to offer to be the chazan if no one else was available. And he had a very distinct way of davening. And so for my childhood, a little bit of the soundtrack of my childhood is hearing Dr. Pasternak lead davening, and for sure Pesachim Ch7 on Shabbos, but also on a weekday. And very special. And I think the family also has similar memories, because I think he would up north would lead davening as well. Anyways, now that this is an important note, but let's also jump into the Gemara. Again, we're talking.
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi.
Before you jump, if one of the categories for meat is whether it's cooked or not, how do we treat people who eat certain meats uncooked, just spicy in some way? Could they somehow say that they could have milk with it?
No, but it's a good question. It's a great question. It's possible, meaning it is possible that the most biblical problem of milk and meat might be when it's cooked with a fusion. But all combinations of milk and meat are unacceptable. But I think you were mechaven to a very important point, which we're going to see very soon, which is that there are other methods of cooking other than heat. And so if that was what you were getting at, if that's what you're getting at, then you were mechaven very, very wisely to a conversation that we will likely either begin today or worst case scenario on Monday. So very well timed. And the Yashikoyach, I'm sorry, we're not going to see it this moment, but hopefully in the next few minutes, we will encounter precisely what you're referring to. So, kol hakavod. Let's give credit where credit is due. Rebel once again mechaven to the intention and the direction of the Gemara. So let's share the screen and see. Rebel barely slept last night, and he's still on the ball like ever. So Baruch Hashem.
Imagine if I was awake.
If you were awake, you would figure out the answer.
Right.
All right. So basically what's happening here is we're exploring the teachings of our Mishnah, our discussion about Karban Pesach, splattering, or the grease or whatever being heated by other elements. And we're trying to use the details of those teachings to inform if we're going to paskin like Rav and Shmuel. And initially, our Mishnah seems to be expressing the viewpoint of Rav, which is that the falling item has a greater impact, compelling the Gemara to clarify. And the Gemara didn't make this up to answer the question, but it brought the following issue to the surface, which is that at least according to Shmuel, the Mishnah is describing that the item that received the schmaltz, the item that received the dripping of the Karban Pesach, was also hot, thus heating up the gravy of the Karban Pesach by a manner of heat that's not Sli Eish. That was yesterday's conversation. Let's put it in the rearview mirror for the moment. We're now going to look at the next little line in our Mishnah, and we're once again going to try to introduce that to our debate if the determining element is the dish that's on top or the dish that's on the bottom. Tanan, our Mishnah says, Notaf miroitvai ala soilas yikmoites mikoimai. Gravy, which is a better translation than I've been talking about. It's the same thing, but it's a good translation. So the gravy drips from the Karban Pesach onto flour. The halacha is yikmoitz es mikoimai. You pinch, you scoop out the whole area where the gravy may have fallen. So as this Chachamim were exploring this Gemara, we went through the following process. Initially, the assumption was that we're talking about cold flour. And if that's the case, that it's cold flour, so Rav would understandably say there's a problem. We perhaps can understand why this is a problem. Rav says ilagavar. And so the heat of the falling element, the element that lands, heats up the flour. It heats up the flour. The hadar udrone, and once it is hot, it can kind of go around the hadra soiles and bring heat and heat up the flour. And now that the flour is hot, it is partially roasting the gravy. Bear with me. I know this is also a stretch. Just bear with me for a moment. So the gravy heats up the flour, and now the flour and the gravy is combined, and maybe the flour can now kind of put heat back into the gravy, and there's an element of cooking that's not from fire. I know it's a stretch. Just let's read the Gemara.
Rabbi, is it possible that being contacted with the gravy, flour becomes chametz? It's Passover.
This is a very good question. At some point, it could turn into chametz, except that it's possible that the gravy has no water or mepei rice. It's just natural fats that are emerging from the animal, and maybe it probably would not actually create chametz. But that's a very interesting point. For sure, it needs to be mentioned. Although again, what I believe is that there are
Also time dimension for heating flour.
I'm sorry.
But there is also time dimension for heating flour because it becomes chametz.
Right. So my first answer, when you asked the question, which was a good one, my initial instinct was okay, but there's time till it turns into chametz, which is what you mentioned. But that's not actually a good answer, because heat expedites something turning into chametz. So that alone would not be a good answer. But what is the right answer is that the liquid that is the gravy is presumably does not trigger leavening. And that would be the better explanation. I have an open mind, so we can explore this further, or we can be open further if there's any other discussion, because what if there is other liquids? We talked about basting the carbon pesach with oil, so I can't tell you with certainty there's never other liquids. My default reading is that we're talking about the natural juices of the carbon pesach, and then you wouldn't have a problem. But it's a good question, and we should keep it on the tab, keep a tab open to re-explore should that become necessary.
Rabbi,
yes, Rabbi.
Maybe it's a silly. What's the flour doing there? Is flour required somewhere around that area? One would think they would just keep flour away.
It sounds like it must be some kind of dish. I don't know exactly what we're describing. I'll tell you what I mean. And your question is a good one. If you read the Mishnah, it reads as an innocent mistake. There was a bag of flour sitting nearby, and somehow it spritzed inside. And now the little bit of the flour that was exposed to the gravy is edible. It's not raw flour. That's what I understood when I read the Mishnah. Then I read Rashi, who tells me it's actually heated flour, and it makes me think that it was some kind of dish that's being eaten. It's being eaten at the Seder. And then one wonders, is it sufficiently seasoned? Can you eat flour? I mean, I can't even imagine you take a handful of flour, throw it on an ungreased frying pan, and toast it. I certainly can't imagine our very fine bleached flour. Maybe we're talking about a coarser substance. So you're asking a good question. What exactly is it doing? My sense is that it's a dish that's been cooked. So then why do we talk about flour? Why don't we talk about anything at all? That's a good question.
I think it acts much more of a thickening agent for a gravy.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what we're talking
Mixed
about.
with the oil.
No, you're correct, but I don't believe that's its use over here, because then we do have the gravy that we're talking about. That's why Alan, your question is a good one and was helpful, because now I get to defend myself. We're talking about spritzing fats and fluids that are emerging from the carbon pesach. I resisted using the word gravy until today. Because I don't like the word gravy, because gravy makes us think of a contemporary kind of situation where you make some kind of accompanying gravy, and there indeed you would use flour. I don't believe that's really what we're talking about. It may classify as gravy, but it's not how we envision gravy. So if we talk about gravy, you're right. We would think that the flour is there to thicken it.
Drippings.
I'm
More
sorry?
of the drippings from the, it'd be more of the drippings from the Korban Pesach, which could be made into gravy.
Drippings can be captured and used as gravy, but I don't believe that's what we're talking about. But that's a very fair point.
It's the drippings. It's what's coming with the oil or the fat that's dissolving and dripping off of the.
right.
And
But
possibly splattering back.
But Alan, it's a good point, and maybe, once again, I'll add that comment to Ribero's comment, to my comment to Ribero, which is that I want to have an open mind about the precise use and nature of this flour. Again, and maybe you're right. Maybe it was used in some kind of, likely it was used in some capacity, as a dish, and I guess why not gravy? So let me revise my statement. Very well could be, and Yasher Koyach for. All right, so now we're contending with an interesting situation where you have a bowl of hot flour, and into it drips some gravy. I'm sorry, right now it's cold. You have cold flour, and into it drips hot gravy. According to Rav, the heat wins the day. What does that mean? The heat wins the day. It means the hot item heats up the cold item. Now, what happens when a hot item heats up a cold item?
Both hot.
The cold item becomes hot. And now you have a hot and cold item heating each other up. When it comes to kosher,
I have a question.
Sorry, 1 second. When it comes to kosher,
Okay.
the issue is exchange of flavor. When it comes to Pesach, the only issue is cooking. So if this was Rav, he would say that this item, and it was a kosher or unkosher item, he would say, oh, it's not kosher. There's two hot items exchanging flavor. That's fine. But that's not really what we're thinking about in this very moment. Right now, we're thinking about, is this a kosher Korban Pesach? And according to Rav, we now understand why it's not a kosher Korban Pesach, because cold flour has now become hot flour. Hot flour can now cook the gravy or the fats, and now the gravy has been cooked by a heat source that's not direct fire. And therefore, this little clump of flour that now has gravy in it can't be eaten because it's Korban Pesach substance that's been cooked in a way that's not fire, so you got to scrape it out and remove it. It's a little bit of a dray, but it actually might make some sense. I mean, it makes sense. And so that is how our Mishnah would be consistent with the teaching of Rav. But what about Shmuel? Shmuel says the lower item is the only temperature to look at. And so if the lower item is cold, it will cool off the gravy and certainly won't itself become hot. At the very least, it will not become hot enough to actually convey cooking to the gravy. The flour will cool down the gravy and not vice versa. So why does Shmuel has to accept the premise of the Mishnah? Why does the Mishnah say you scoop away the space where it dripped? David, tell him to come into the shul for a second. Oh, he's not okay. And so Shmuel will have to explain the Mishnah that we're talking about hot flour. What happens if we're talking about hot flour is simple. The hot flour now conveys heat to the gravy, and this gravy can only be kosher if the only heat source, the only cooking effect is tzli eish, it's fire, and hot flour is not considered fire. Now, Shmuel can explain the Mishnah, but only if we're talking about that the flour is hot. Okay. Comments, questions?
There is another component, and this one is how much time does it take to cook a Korban Pesach? And since it is a fixed substance, I would assume that it should take a long time. However, as far as gravy is concerned, or any juices, why do we assume that they can receive further cooking? They already cooked. So whatever they dripped, it's a cooked substance. So how come that we discuss what happens to this substance in terms of further cooking?
So, Professor, first of all, I want to agree with you that my understanding, I think, is the same as yours, that this gravy is fully cooked. It would not be considered a raw juice, it's a cooked juice. However, apparently, based on what we're reading so far, the halachas of Korban Pesach and the Mishnah, which conveys them, does not care if the item is already cooked. It only cares about any contributing heat source. And so, for example, we talk about a sear. You might cook a steak and then sear it. The steak is fully cooked, but there's some effect that the searing contributes. Or Schellenberg, is that called a reverse sear? Yeah. Okay, so Rabbi Schellenberg, who's a much bigger authority on cooking methods, certainly when it comes to fire applied to meat, tells me that there's such a thing as a reverse sear, which is the meat is fully cooked, or it could even be fully cooked, and yet there's something about this here. My only point to that is that you can cook something after it's been cooked, and although it was cooked prior, it contributes enough to the experience that it's considered additional cooking.
Rabbi, question?
Hold on, one second. Professor, does that answer your comment? Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, one more thing, Ellie, before you go. Alan, is Karen there?
Want to see her?
Well, no, I didn't say no. Don't bother her. Oh, Karen, hello. Welcome back.
Move over.
She's the one with the
Alan,
good
move
day.
over.
24 hours ago, I was saying goodbye to you at your shul, saying goodbye to you and Shana.
Yep. So that's why
And here I am.
You made it. Okay, good. Baruch Hashem.
Here.
And you look as fresh.
God willing, safe and sound.
Well, welcome home. All right, thank you. Ellie.
That's why I have a smile on my face.
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem.
Rabbi, the question I'm asking is, how long do we determine temperature?
Could you mind adding a few more words to explain your question? What do you mean?
You know the question which I'm asking. How do we determine how much temperature of the fire, of the flame? Because if you put your hand next to the flame, for 5 seconds, you won't get burned. If you put it closer for 5 seconds, you will get burned.
So
what are we determining how?
So I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you what I told Dr. Hammer yesterday, which I guess the first thing I should say is I still have some outstanding questions. So that's the first thing I told Dr. Hammer. But the second thing I told Dr. Hammer is that it appears that for this Korban Pesach, well, let's talk about kosher. For kosher purposes, which we're using almost as synonymous or identical, if it's a dish that emerged just now from the fire, and it's yad soledesbo, the hand recoils from its heat, it's hot enough to convey flavor. And I suppose because we're lining them up as identical ideas, it would also be sufficient heat to actually cook. So that's what I can share with you. Broadly speaking, again, we're going to start getting into the intricacies. We can start talking about different degrees and temperatures, and you'll lose me and I'll lose you. But at least broadly, that's what we're talking about as far as heat. I have a hard time with cold, though. I told this to Dr. Hammer, and the more I learn the Gemara, the more it sounds like the cold that we're talking about is not chilled. It's more like room temperature or not hot. And I'll tell you more than that, Dr. Hammer and Rebelli and everyone else. I don't think the Gemara is saying that if a hot thing falls on a cold item, the cold item's temperature rises. That's not what we're not saying that's not true. Of course, if a hot item falls on a cold item, the temperature rises. The question is, what extent will the temperature rise? Will it rise to be hot enough to actually cook? And so we're not science deniers here. We're not saying that a hot thing can fall onto a room temperature thing. We're not saying that the room temperature thing will not become hotter. We could observe this. We could put a thermometer, or today they have really, I have to call Schellenberg, but I don't want to bother him. But today you really can put probes that can get you the very, very precise temperature of multiple locations in your steak. And so we could put one of those thermometer type probes into each steak and we could do an experiment. And I believe my hypothesis is that you will note the temperature rising if a 200-degree item falls on top of it. The only question is if the heat is sufficient to raise it up to the point where it'll be considered able to convey flavor or able to cook. And that's the debate of Rab and Shmuel. No one is denying that there will be some kind of fluctuation in the temperature. And I think that's an important clarification that I probably should have made yesterday. But Ellie, thanks to your line of questioning along with Dr. Hammer, I'm able to now tell you my latest understanding and impression. It is. So Dr. Hammer, is that a fair update? I don't mean, I'm sorry, I know maybe thermometers is a sore topic at the moment, but
right.
all right. Okay. So now what
Bernie,
we've
you
done
better
is,
agree with him.
I'm sorry.
I said, Bernie better agree with you.
All right. So now,
Well,
we
I'll agree. I'll agree with you, or orally, I agree with you.
now we have already two little segments of the Mishnah, which it's easier reading actually reflects the teaching of Rav. Because why would you suppose the site that the gravy landed is also hot? There's no indication in the Mishnah. But twice, in order for Shmuel to make sense and continue to maintain that tata gavar, the item on the bottom is going to ultimately influence the temperature, we have to revise or not revise the language of the Mishnah, but we need to add the unwritten language, which is the landing site was hot as well. But Shmuel can defend himself, in the face of our Mishnah. Now, we're going to go to a third item on the Mishnah. And once again, Shmuel is going to have to explain our Mishnah to make it make sense. The interesting thing is, I don't know if you remember, we noted in the beginning of the Gemara, or was it Rashi who told us? That we paskin like Shmuel, right? Yeah, Rashi told us. We paskin like Shmuel. So although the Gemara now seems to be struggling to understand Shmuel, ultimately, halachically, we're going to actually be signing off and accepting Shmuel's take. Okay, now third thing. And let's go back to our mission. Third item. We noted that if the carbon Pesach was smeared. Does someone use the word smear in English? I know smear is a very well used Yiddish word. But would you use
English
this
would
in
be
polite
smear.
company? Do you smear?
Smear is English.
No, I know
Smear at
smear
all.
is English. I'm asking if you'll use the word smear as much as we'll use the word schmear in Yiddish. Okay.
Oh, smear, yeah. Of course, you
We
know
don't-
how
this
Yiddish
can
words
stay
work
unanswered.
in English.
Shalom Aleichem. Now you know where we're at. Anyways, okay. Irrelevant. You smear the carbon Pesach with oil of truma. So truma can only be consumed by koyanim that are tahar. So can this truma be consumed? So the Mishnah says, Im chaburas koyanim, if the people that are going to eat the carbon Pesach are koyanim, zu gesund, yoichelu, eat it. Now, Professor, this is the reason why I couldn't tell you with absolute certainty about the status of the gravy, because I suppose if the gravy had oil in it, then it would probably have the capacity to be mashmas. But anyways, Im shal Yisrael. Now, if this is an Israelite's carbon Pesach, Im chayu, if the carbon Pesach is raw, yadichenu, rinse it off. Im salihu, but if the carbon Pesach is roasted, yikloif es hachitza, and you peel off an exterior layer. Now, the carbon Pesach is hot. And the carbon Pesach is the tata. It's the thing that's being smeared upon. According to Rav. Now, I want to tell you, I have a lot of questions here. I'm just going to tell you up front. But let's first learn the Gemara, and then I'll According to Rav, the Amar Ila Gavar, he says we always look at the landing element. This is the reason why all he wants is peeling a thin layer. Mishum Dila Tsoinenhu. Because the landing item is cold, and therefore you only need to remove the slightest bit. It doesn't turn the whole thing treif. Hold the questions just for a moment. Let's absorb this in. El Shmuel, but according to Shmuel Damar Tata Gavar, who always says that the bottom element dictates the temperature. Being that we're talking about a roasted carbon pesach, mivla bola, it's surely going to absorb the oil. And now the whole carbon pesach is truma e, which for a kohen is perfectly fine. For a non-kohen is terribly not fine. And it's going to be fully absorbed in because the dictator of the temperature is the tata, the bottom. So why do you only need to peel off a little bit? Nitzar legamri, the whole carbon pesach should become one piece of thoroughly absorbed truma. So the Gemara answers, you're right and you're wrong. Shani sicha, there's a distinction between smearing on a little oil and a thick ribeye. Dimashu bahalma huda avida. Because the oil is a minuscule amount that's been smeared, so it's only going to be absorbed into the periphery or to the exterior of the carbon pesach. There is not enough substance to become absorbed all the way through and through. Can't saturate the meat. Fully, it only manages to impact the exterior layer, the peeling layer. Okay, what are my questions? Or why should I confuse you with my questions? Let's first see the answer, and then I'll tell you my questions. So again, Rav, the oil, which is cold, dictates the situation. And so when applied, it's not able to really be absorbed into the carbon pesach. But according to Shmuel, it should be a problem. I'm sorry, we gave the answer. More answer, Shani Hacha. Here are my questions. My reading of the Mishnah did not default assume the way the Gemara learns the Mishnah. I'll tell you why. The way I learn the Mishnah is like this. You put oil on the carbon pesach. If it is chai, if the carbon pesach hasn't yet been cooked, so then you can wipe it off because it hasn't been cooked. But if you roast it with the oil on it, so then it fully absorbs because it went into the fire along with the oil. That's how I understood it. But now the Gemara is saying, and again, it's not really a question, it's just more clarity. The way the Gemara is learning the Mishnah, the question is when you apply the oil. Did you apply the oil before it went in and you stopped it in time? Or did you apply the oil onto the hot carbon pesach after it emerged? Why might you apply oil on a carbon pesach after it emerges? Well, maybe the roasting, because you want it to be well cooked, dries it out a little bit. And so you want to freshen it up or you want to put a little moisture on it. So I guess it's not really a question. It's just that I didn't learn the Mishnah in a default. I didn't default to learn the Mishnah that way. If you say that the oil goes into the fire, Rav and Shmuel should agree that it would be a problem. But now that we've established, and again, the Gemara is going to talk more about this, so maybe I'm confusing things. Now that we've established that according to Rav, you only need to peel off a little bit, would the same thing apply if the carbon pesach actually went into the fire with this oil on it? Because it's so minuscule. Hold on, we're getting some background noise. So these are some questions I have. Oh, let's look at Tosfos, and then we can. Mishum hachi sagile beklipa. Let's go back here. According to Rav, Ila Gavar, Amdulahachi sagile beklipa. Mishum. So Tosfos says, okay, going. Obviously, we're talking about shasachu achar shatzalai. You actually apply the oil after it was roasted. And it could not have been even a little bit of time in the oven. Shem loikein agidei retichas hataner hoya nivla afilu man da'amar ilah gavar. Ilah gavar only works when there's no additional heat source. But if you put a cold thing on a hot thing and then you put it both in the oven, the cold thing becomes hot. So Tosfos makes my point. Clearly, we're talking about that it had to have been after the, which I guess Rashi would say this is so obvious he doesn't need to say it. Doctor, I'm sorry, doctor?
No, I'm good.
Okay. But according to what we're saying, that Kedei Klipa. Okay, anyways, so there you have it. So the Mishnah talks about oil. Why is it a problem why is it not a problem according to Shmuel if you're smearing a boiling hot tata gavar carbon Pesach? And so he answers, you're right, it's a very minuscule amount, however, and therefore the Isser would only manage to permeate or to penetrate the periphery, the surface of the carbon Pesach. So what if you put it into the oven? You put it into an oven, you should say the same thing, right? It's only enough oil to permeate the surface. Okay, I think that question may be beyond the scope of this discussion, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Also, I think the Gemara is going to talk a little more. I'm sorry, we're getting ahead of ourselves because there's more Gemara that's going to talk about this more. So let's move on. Tanya Kavasei the Shmuel. And here's where we'll see some helpful added notes. There's a brisa that follows that projects that is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, which says as follows: Cham l'teicham. A hot food falls onto a hot food. One is kosher, one is unkosher, or one is milk and one is meat. Let's say asur is prohibited. V'chein soinein shenosan l'toichacham. Similarly, if you'll pour or place a cold item to a hot item, asur is prohibited. Cham l'toich soinein. If you put a hot item onto a cold item or into a cold item, it's soinen l'toich soinen, or a cold item into a cold item, mediach, all you need to do is rinse it off. Cham l'toich soinen mediach. Why do we say that you only need to rinse off a hot item that falls onto a cold item? And this is again going to be helpful for our understanding of the Mishnah about Pesachim Ch7. Kivan the chamhu, being that it's hot, ademekale, until the cold receiving dish manages to cool it off. There should be at least a nominal exchange. Klipa miyanivi, we should still need at least the removal of the surface. And the Gemara says, Taka, this is true. Elaima, rather, the text should read, if the hot item falls into a cold dish, koileif, you should peel the exterior. If cold falls in the cold, then madiach, all you need to do is rinse it off. And so, for having the Gemara accepts a slight revision or modification in our understanding of the brisa to say that if a hot item falls into a cold item, it's not going to be fully treif, but you have to remove the exterior, which in the time that it cools off will still have an exchange of flavor. Because it doesn't become fully hot, it's not able to draw the flavor all the way into its interior. And indeed, I think this is, let's go back to our probes. We drop a hot ribeye onto a cold ribeye. And we said, of course, the bottom ribeye the temperature will rise, but it won't rise sufficiently to become hot enough to draw in the flavor as is understood by halacha, but at least the surface, the exterior will probably become hot enough. And the Gemara now says, indeed, we'll have to remove the surface because the surface probably will become heated up to the level that it could draw into it the flavor. So this is all, in a way, a sideshow, let's say, or a side analysis to the primary issue, which is that Shmuel is supported here because the Brisa says Then if it falls into a hot dish, it's treif. But if it falls into a cold dish, it's kosher, maybe with some modification. So this is brisa number 1 that reflects the opinion of Shmuel. Shmuel.
Rabbi,
Yes.
why don't we mention the time element? The longer a hot thing stays on a cold thing, the more warm the cold thing will be.
So Rebel, here's the question. There's a race
it fell
against
on
the...
it for a minute, or it sat there all overnight.
No. There's a race against the clock. If a hot item falls on a cold item, 2 things happen. The cold item becomes less cold, and the hot item becomes less hot. But what happens first is, does the hot item manage to heat up the cold item sufficiently to be considered hot that it's drawing into it its flavor, or
It
the
depends.
reverse?
Depends how long it's on it.
So Shmuel and Rav both don't agree with you that it's a time issue. They believe that, there is a time element, but the primary issue is not time. The primary issue is which works faster than the other. Because as long as the hot item is cooled faster than it heats the cold item, there will never be an exchange of unkosher flavor for the purposes of kashrus. It's a good question. And time is real, but it's not the time that we're really concerned about. It's just
I'm leaving.
which one moves faster. Now, all of us would suppose that there are many variables that should be considered. For example, what if you have the world's largest hamburger on a world's largest grill, and you take it off, and the world's smallest slice of cheese, okay, slice of cheese might melt, but if the world's smallest cheese Danish, I don't know, falls onto it. So you imagine that Jack, you're laughing, but you like the imagery. Anyways, but for now, let's keep it as is. Let's look at the Rambam, who
I have
codifies.
to leave. Rabbi.
I'm sorry,
I have to leave.
Alan. We're glad you're with us. It was good to see Karen. Feel good.
Have a good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
I don't know
Good
if there's-
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Rabbi, there's also another element. In what kind of container are we dealing with? Is it covering the whole surface? Is it covering only a corner?
Yeah.
All kinds of variables.
Like Beryl, is it falling into a pot of mac and cheese, which means that it's actually being fully submerged? Is it landing on a ribeye like we've been describing until now? These are good questions. These are questions that can and should be clarified, but for the Gemara's purpose, let's leave it as vague as the Gemara is leaving it, so we can develop this idea slowly. But let's look at the Rambam here. Meat is kosher, milk is kosher, assuming it's kosher. But if they should be cooked together, irony of ironies, it's one of the unique things about basar v'chalav is that they're both kosher until they're introduced, and then it's terribly treif. When would it be classified as basar v'chalav? If they were both cooked together in a pot or an oven. Or if a hot item fell to a hot item. And if you look at the language here, it's letoich, into. So maybe we need to read a little more into the word into. But anyways, the hot item falls into the hot item, or a cold item falls into the hot item. But if one fell to the other, if a hot item falls into or onto a cold item, our Gemara's language here, peel just the exterior layer wherever the meat touched the dairy, and the balance is kosher. Cheese Danish, okay. Are you in touch with the Salems? Your cousins? Yosef and who's the other one? Not Jacob. Who's the one that's around?
What do you want me to tell them?
Tell them I say hello?
Oh, you said hello? Yes.
Tell them I say hello.
I see them, yeah.
Tell Joseph I'm going to crash his office one day. All right.
The Rebbe.
But if a cold item falls into a cold item, you just need to rinse it off. Technically, you can keep in your travel pack cold cuts and cheese. I know really no one should ever eat cold cuts, but cold cuts and cheese in one bag, they shouldn't be touching. But if they did touch Madiach Habas or Madiach Hagvina V'Eichel, you just need to rinse them off. Now hold on one second. It's the same halacha.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
is it possible that there is some economic considerations here? Because
this
the
halacha
simple
or
thing
in the
would be
general-
to say throw everything out.
The economics consideration is that we're not going to prohibit something that's kosher. But we're not going to be concerned about not permitting something that's unkosher.
No, because we have a similar situation. You find meat. Is there a kosher butcher near there? I always was taught that part of it was, who would ask that shaila? A gvir wouldn't ask a shaila. Throw it out.
The idea is very simple. We don't believe in wasting. So halacha wants to know what the matter of halacha is. Not, of course, it's always easy to say throw everything out all the time, anytime. I was speaking to an Av Beis Din recently, and he was telling me that a lot of times the way a rabbi responds to a shaila is not verbally. Is very critical because there's shalom bayis issues. Let's say a husband calls up the rabbi or comes to see the rabbi, says, my wife used a fleshik spoon in a milchig dish. What's the status? If the rabbi says, oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened. That's terrible. So what is he conveying to the spouse? That what your spouse did is terrible. And so even if the halacha is no good, it's important that the rabbi be composed and respond. That's a good question. It's a mistake that happens very often. I frequently get such a question, and it happens all the time. And here is the course of action. And so beyond the halachic matter, presentation is very important. I don't even remember how I was getting.
He could tell him to get a get.
Or the rabbi could say, I have another side business. Here's my business card for Gittin. God forbid.
No. All you have to do, Rabbi, is say, my wife does it all the time.
The rabbi says, I do it all the time.
Only,
No big
Bernie,
deal.
only on this chavrusa do you get such insights.
But this is really, if you create tension or angst around, again, not that you want to downplay kashrus, but it's very important for shalom bayis purposes. It's essential to be nonchalant while conveying the truth of the matter. And I thought that was very insightful, and vice versa as well. Women can also ask questions. Actually, it's probably more likely to happen that the husband messes things up than the wife, and so more likely than not, it's the wife approaching the rabbi. The rabbi, so it can go both ways.
Well, there's the story about it's a story. I don't know if it's true or not. About Moshe came into the kitchen, and after 5 minutes, the Rebbetzin threw him out. He said, "You're gonna trafe up my kitchen in no time."
Yeah.
It's definitely a good agada. The point is good. All right, one more brisa and then we'll call it a day. Tanya idach. There's another brisa that describes basar reteach, boiling hot meat shenafel l'toich chalav reteach that falls into a hot milk pot. V'chein soinein shenafel l'toich cham. Similarly, if a cold item falls into a hot item, kosher and unkosher, also prohibited. Why? Because the reteach, they're both hot, or the bottom, the receiving, the pot is hot. But if hot item falls into a cold dish, or cold into cold madiach, you rinse it off. If the hot falls in the cold, rinse it off. Keep in the chamu. The maker, the Gemara says, but 1 second. While during the time that the meat is going to be cooled down, it's still going to manage to absorb a little milk. So the Gemara says, you should still have to take off a peel. a second brisa that is also reflecting the same idea. Tata gavar. One last line, Reb Beryl. I don't want to leave you on a cliffhanger. Amar mar. All right, let's discuss this a little bit. So, if a cold item falls into a cold item, you just need to rinse it off. Are you sure? Is there never a scenario where a cold item could fall into a cold item and yet there'll be an exchange of flavor? Rav Huna clarified. This is only if it wasn't a salted item, and in a moment we're going to clarify how much salt. So give a second. If the dish was a salty dish, asur, it cannot be. It's not kosher. Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel teaches a very salty item exchanges flavor, just as a hot item exchanges flavor. And indeed, kavush, hare, or similarly, kavush, hare hu kimivushal, an item that is pickled, an item that is brined in vinegar, is classified halachically as if it is cooked, and maybe culinarily as well. And therefore, Reb Beryl, you very fairly and appropriately noted at the beginning of our Gemara, Chabura, that if the two items are brining together, they can also exchange flavor. Now, the Gemara is going to qualify, and I guess we'll have to go to this on Monday, that we're not talking about any salt. We're talking about salty enough that it's inedible. So there's an ordinary amount of salt that's just used for flavor. That's not going to cause exchanges. But if...
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi.
There's a whole other area. What about the pot itself? What kind of pot? Earthenware and all that stuff?
Indeed. That's not the direction that the Gemara is going in the moment. The Gemara is just clarifying that if a very, very cold but salty piece of meat falls into a bowl of milk or vice versa, it can still absorb the flavor. Potentially, and that's exactly, Rebel, if I'm not mistaken, what you brought up in the beginning of our discussion. My dear friends, this takes us to our close, the close of our pre-Shabbos study session. May Hashem bless Klal Yisrael, that this Erev Shabbos and Shabbos should be a time that brings us a lot of good news for all of Klal Yisrael, and particularly from Israel. And may all those on the world stage who seek to disarm or harm or reject Israel or not protect Israel's interest, may they be thwarted, and may Israel be able to do what it needs to do in a safe, successful, blessed, harmonious manner. And the harmonious part is way above my pay grade. But anyways, Hashem should help.
Right.
And dear friends, have a wonderful day. Good Shabbos.
Have a great Shabbos. Have a great
yeah.
Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, everybody.
God.
I found a screen.